So welcome to everyone, those that are watching live and also those that will hopefully watch the recording. So this is the first of 5 sessions on professionalism that's being hosted by the Spanish and Portuguese congregation. I'm not sure where our guests are from, but I'll just welcome in general, especially high school students and CEGEP students who are thinking of becoming professionals, and also university students who are already studying in one of the professional streams. So the aim of this series is to clarify to non-professionals exactly what is the meaning of a professional. That's with a capital P, as opposed to the common use of this term to mean anyone who performs their work at a very high standard. Furthermore, since this is being hosted by an Orthodox synagogue, our speakers were asked to talk about what being a Jewish professional means to them, and with this being with the added layer of Halakha and Jewish ethics. I might add that with few exceptions, all speakers in the series are members of the Spanish and Portuguese or Chevra Shas congregations. Our first speaker in this session will describe the general background of professionalism as covered in provincial legislation, and the second will give examples of discussions in the Talmud and other sources about the rabbinic profession that should impact their professional life. Although currently the clergy is not really recognized as a profession in Quebec, and perhaps we could ask Rabbi Pinto to spearhead in the future that they should be. So each speaker will speak for approximately 30 minutes, and then there'll be a question period of 20 to 30 minutes, and that'll be moderated by myself. So I think everyone's mic except maybe Professor Archibald and myself's microphones are on mute, and that's good. So only the speaker's microphone should be on. Okay, so our first speaker is Professor James Archibald, who has degrees from McGill, University of Montreal, and Université de Lille in France. He has teaching and research experience in the areas of management, business communication, and translation studies. He's a professor in the Department of Language and Intercultural Communication at McGill. And more importantly for this series, is a member of the Office des Professions du Québec. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor over to Professor Archibald.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. I'm speaking this evening in my personal capacity. I'm not speaking on behalf of the government of Quebec. So I just wanted to be clear that any pronouncements that I may make are not being made on behalf of the government. However, I am the longest serving member of the Office des Professions du Québec, and so I do have some knowledge of the background. The question for us today is what is, in fact, a professional? And more importantly, what does it mean for a professional to be bound by certain ethical constraints or certain deontological constraints? And so I want to ask a few questions and maybe find a few answers. We start out by asking who are the professionals, to look at that in context. That obviously will require us to look at the professional code to see what it means as a piece of framework legislation, to look at the common parts of the code of ethics which each professional order has to have. Given the history going back to the early 70s of the professional system in Quebec, I especially wanted to underscore the issue of femininity and masculinity in the professions. This is of particular importance given the evolution of Quebec society since the early 70s, the end of the 60s. Then I would like to look at 2 different approaches to ethics in the professions. One is a minimalist approach, the other is a maximalist approach. and try to bring that together in a statement which we had written for the Office des Professions a few years ago, which focuses on the societal responsibility of practicing professionals. Basically, if we move on to slide number 2, when we ask the question, who are the professionals? The simple answer to the question is professionals, as recognized by the Quebec government, are people who have fulfilled all of the educational requirements of a program which is recognized as giving access to a professional designation, and they have been admitted into the practice of that profession. In most cases, as far as Quebec educational system is concerned, that means having a terminal diploma, which gives people the competencies required for a particular professional practice. So if you look at the framework legislation, practicing professionals in Quebec have simply one role. It's quite easy, in fact. And the role of that professional in Quebec is to protect the public. And that protection of the public is assured, if you will, through the preservation of standards and the promotion of standards, but standards of quality and standards of integrity. In other words, the professional is expected to follow certain quality control and quality assurance practices, and is expected also to act with integrity in the exercise of his or her profession. So that means that every person practicing as a recognized professional must adhere to a code of ethics according to the mandate entrusted to them by law. In other words, the code of ethics is a compulsory regulation which all professional orders have to adopt. The code of ethics, when it's initially adopted by the order, is first published in the official gazette for commentary by the general public and by interested parties. It is then published in its final version and goes into effect, and in fact has force of law. So although the code of ethics is a regulation, it has force of law, and people can be held responsible with respect to the actual content of the code of ethics. And so the applicable legislation in Quebec in this regard is the professional code, the purpose of which is to ensure the protection of the public. And the Office des Professions does that through the surveillance, the supervision, and the maintenance of quality services through the different professional bodies, which are called orders in Quebec. So hence, all professional orders and their members are enlisted in a process which is designed to promote the individual and collective socioeconomic interests and well-being of the beneficiaries of recognized professional services. To unpack that, what that means is, if we can go back to the previous slide just for one moment, to unpack that, what we mean is that historically, when the code was initially adopted back in the early 70s, the focus was very much on the individual responsibility of each practicing professional. At that point in time, the professionals concerned were mostly in the healthcare area, that is to say, mostly doctors, because that was the point in time which the health system was nationalized in Quebec, and also people involved in the accounting profession. Back in that time, there were 3 accounting professions. Now there's only 1. So that is the general gist of that at that particular point in time. And we've evolved more today toward collective responsibilities with regard to professionals as compared to the sort of corporatist individual approach of the early 70s. So moving on to the next slide, We look at the professional system, which, as I pointed out, came into force in 1973, following the adoption of the first version of the professional code, which has been changed many times since, because almost every time there's a new government, we add different amendments to the code. The code establishes two different types of professional orders. One type of order has exclusive rights of practice. So if we give the example of physicians, for instance, they have an exclusive right of practice. And there are other orders which have a reserved designation. In other words, their expertise is recognized, but they do not have a particular area of practice which is reserved. And so this applies to people like translators, for instance. The purpose of both, however, is to make sure that the public is protected. So any user of professional service has recourse against services provided by a professional which are not up to standard. So, and all of these orders, which have been created since 1973, are supervised by an independent governing body, which was created by the Quebec legislature, and it's called the Office des Professions, and it operates under the authority of the minister responsible for the application of professional laws. Currently, the minister responsible for that area is Madame McCann, who, as you recall, used to be the Minister of Health, and she's now the Minister of Higher Education and has responsibility for all the professional laws. This is the first time, in fact, in years, that someone outside the Ministry of Justice has been responsible for this area. Mrs. McCann actually works fairly closely with Jean Barrette, who is the Minister of Justice, but it is her primary responsibility in the current government. At this point in time, there are 55 recognized professions, and that includes about 400,000, a little bit more than 400,000 practicing professionals. And as I said before, all of these practicing professionals are bound by a code of ethics, which has force of law. So if we move on to look at the framework, the Quebec legislation very often adopts pieces of law which are called framework laws. In other words, the law sets up a stage, if you will, for working in a particular area. And the law then actually becomes functional through the number of regulations which are adopted. And so as a working member of the Office des Professions, we spend most of our time, in fact, passing different regulations in different areas which affect all of these practicing professionals. And so although there are 55 professions, they are sometimes grouped together. And so we actually have only 46 professional orders, which are the institutions which are responsible for the protection of the public. So the office itself has supervisory responsibilities and has the responsibility of controlling all of these different orders. And the most important probably function within that is the approval and adoption of the regulations which govern the whole system. So that essentially is the framework that we work in, and each order has as its primary responsibility the protection of the public. So all of this actually works hand in glove, if you will. And as I said before, each group has to adopt a code of ethics. So the code of ethics can be broken down to understand it from two perspectives. One is the deontological perspective, and the other is the ethical perspective. On the one hand, it looks at the actual issues of practice, what you can actually do in terms of running your practice in a particular professional area. And the other, of course, deals more with the moralistic or pure ethical issues involved in the practice of the profession. So if we move on to look at the actual code itself, we can look at the common elements of all of the codes. So I didn't want to take the time to look at each individual code because that would have been a whole semester's course. So I simply wanted to pull out some of the commonalities in these different codes. So to start out with, there is always a preamble to these codes. And if I look at what is common to most of the codes, is that they try to place the ethical and deontological issues brought up in the code in a social context, in an economic context, so that you understand where the professional is actually practicing and what the impact of that practice might be. And again, one of the key elements that runs through all of these codes is the maintenance of the dignity of the profession itself, which I think is extremely important because it's very difficult for a professional to practice if he doesn't or she doesn't hold his or her profession in high esteem. The most recent change that we have made to these codes was one that we made just a few weeks ago to the Code of Ethics in the bar, in the Quebec bar. And this dealt with the protection of clients and beneficiaries' fundamental rights, including the right to be free from discrimination and harassment. We talk about discrimination as an abstract term when we speak about it in English. However, in the French text, we were very careful to point out the fact that we talked about discriminatory acts. So we looked at the plurality of discriminatory acts that can actually take place. And then we looked at the issue of harassment, whether it be physical or psychological within a professional context. And you can see that if you follow the news, that this was a reaction, in fact, a number of cases which came up where there had been either physical harassment or discrimination or, in fact, psychological harassment at the same time. So this is something where the professional, especially dealing with other people, has to be held accountable. You can imagine how this plays itself out in the healthcare system, in the legal system, and so on in different areas. The next section dealing with professional conduct is more of a deontological nature, in the sense that it looks at how you actually work within the constraints of a particular profession. Then most of the codes deal with duties to clients and beneficiaries. The one you can see on the screen, the different common features, but the one which I'd like to underscore is the one which deals with communication, because professionals communicate with beneficiaries or their clients or their patients, etc., in such a way that the client has to be able to understand the actual intervention which is being made by the practicing professional. So that is extremely important. And so in doing so, it's important for the professional to be able to apply the principles of plain language. In other words, that is the legal principle of the right to understand. So the beneficiary or the client actually has a right to understand. Notaries understand this quite well in the sense that when they, for instance, have a client who is drafting a will, The will has to be read out viva voce to the client to make sure that the client actually understands. There's a whole historical background to that. We can talk about that some other time, but that's one of the reasons why communication is extremely important for the professional. And you can see in the healthcare area why that's important. The other part which is important in this particular section is the importance to update knowledge and skills. In other words, there's also another regulation which all orders have to adopt, which deals with continuing professional education. And more these days, we're adopting regulations which deal with compulsory continuing education to make sure that the skills and the knowledge that a professional has in order to practice are actually maintained on a regular basis. Moving on to the duties pertaining to the different mandates that professionals have. One of the issues, which I think you'll note later in the presentation, is the duty to show care. It sounds a bit strange to remind professionals that they actually have to demonstrate care for their clients and their patients. But this is something which goes back in history. And the one person who came to mind, actually, when I was putting this together, because we talked about this when we discussed the 250th anniversary of the Spanish and Portuguese, was one of our members who's no longer with us, unfortunately, is Esther Blaustein Zikonariwaha, who was very active as a nurse. And she demonstrated in her life this obligation of care. And she also demonstrated in Quebec society her obligation of care to her fellow citizens, in that she was a very active member of the Fédération des Femmes du Québec. And so she was not only a practicing professional, but she was also engaged in social and political activities. If we move on then to the duties of the professional, one of the duties which I think that's in the next slide, Ronnie. One of the duties which I think is important to underscore here is the collaboration with public authorities. Obviously, it's clear in the case of lawyers and notaries what this means. But if we look in the healthcare sector and in the engineering sector, for instance, we see some very interesting examples from our own community. The one which I would like to mention to you is a person whom you probably know. His name is Zaki Gavitian, who used to be a member of the Spanish, but he's moved on now. But he was at one point in time very active in the engineering community, and he was in fact a member of the executive committee of the Order of Engineers of Quebec. Just to show you that it's important for practicing professionals within the community to become involved in the governance of the profession as well. And that's part of their public duty. So there's an expectation in the Code of Ethics to be involved in public duty, to provide service to the community. The other aspect of that is the importance of exchanging knowledge and experience with others. In other words, if the professional has knowledge and experience which can be to the benefit of the greater society, it's important that from an ethical point of view, that the professional actually share that if he or she has the expertise to do that. The one example that comes up to mind immediately is an example of Carl Weiss, who is a member of the College of Physicians in Quebec, and who is the president of the Association des médecins microbiologistes et infectologues du Québec, and who has been, during this whole pandemic, one of the people that the media run to in order to get solid scientific information about the pandemic. The other example, which I wanted to mention in this particular case also comes from the medical community, and the example I wanted to cite is Nicole Ezer, who works at the MUHC and who is very much involved in research and has provided also for even the Sisterhood of the Spanish and Portuguese conferences dealing with medical practice and research as far as respiratory diseases are concerned. So those are examples of people who actually put their ethics into practice and actually do something which is compatible with that. From a deontological point of view, there are restrictions with regard to advertising and public relations, in the sense that people must not provide misleading information or incorrect information to the public. And of course, the same theme which was mentioned at the beginning is that they must maintain the dignity of the profession and the reputation of the profession. So historically, if we can move on to the next slide, Ronnie, I wanted to mention the fact that historically, many professions in Quebec have been tagged, if you will, as either feminine or masculine professions. You have to go back mentally to the 1960s and 70s in order to understand this, I think. Hofstadter, in his research, clearly points out that there, from a cultural point of view, there are two orientations. The one which I think is important to think about in this area is the femininity function or dimension, which is marked by empathy. Whereas, according to Hofstadter, the masculinity dimension is focused much more on independence and aggressiveness, etc. So I'll let your imagination run to see how that actually can work out. But it's interesting if you have a chance to read Hofstadter on this and to see how it actually affects how professional groups may actually function. Moving on to the next slide to show that this actually plays itself out into reality, I looked into the demographics of the professions in Quebec just to give you an idea of how this breaks down. And in fact, nearly the majority of professions in Quebec are female dominated. In other words, the membership is mostly female in the professions which are listed here. I'll not rattle off the whole list, but if you look at the list, you will note that many of these professions are in the healthcare area and deal with the importance of providing care for people. So in fact, the Hofstadter position on the femininity dimension of these professions plays itself out in this particular list. So I won't go into the particular details. I can give you tons of examples if we had time, but I'll skip that. The other side of the coin is what we refer to as the traditional male-dominated professions. And these are the ones which have maybe a greater degree of aggressivity in them. They may have a greater degree of the importance of assertion, etc. I'll spare you all of the psychobabble from Hofstadter as far as that's concerned, but it's important to look at that. Just to point out a couple of interesting issues in here is that the two orders, engineers and the forestry engineers, are today, as they have been for many, many years, male-dominated professions. It's interesting to note, however, that the current president of the Order of Engineers in Quebec is a woman. And I think that's important because when you look at even though it's very much a male-dominated profession when you look at the numbers today. When we look at our faculties in the different universities in Quebec, there are more and more women who are coming out of the faculties, and eventually they will catch up in terms of the distribution within the actual order itself. So things are changing. And if we look at the third group that I pulled out in the next slide, these are what I call the egalitarian professions. And as you can see, there are fewer of them. This is where you have more or less an equal balance of the number of men and women practicing in these professions. The two that I think are interesting to look at here, they're all interesting, but the two that are probably most interesting from an evolutionary point of view are the lawyers and the professional accountants. Traditionally, if we move back to the 70s, these were male-dominated professions. And what has happened is that the faculties have produced more and more new lawyers, more and more new accountants, etc. And that, in fact, some of our faculties of law now produce more female graduates than male graduates. So the demographics are changing. What is interesting to go back to harken back to Hofstadter's point of view is that women lawyers have had to adapt in terms of behavior so that they moved into a profession which was clearly dominated by male pattern behaviors, and they have had to adopt to these things. That, I think, explains in part one of the reasons why women, although they are now in an equal position demographically in the profession, have not moved up in the scale to the more senior leadership positions. Of course, there are a number of exceptions to that rule. One of them being that the current president of the Order of Professional Accountants in Quebec is also a woman. So that's important. And then to go back to the healthcare ones, the current president of the Order of Nurses in Quebec is a man. And another interesting demographic is that if you look at the midwives in Quebec, there's actually a man who is a member of the Order of Midwives. So that's an interesting situation. So with that demographic sort of as a backdrop, let's look at the ethical position in terms of maximalist and minimalist approaches to these issues. Briefly, if we look at this on a scale, and you go back to the 70s, it's much easier to understand, is that initially when the focus was more on the individual and the corporatist type of environment back in the early 70s, the ethical approach was much more of a minimalist approach, where you were held to certain rules and regulations in order not to harm others, the principle of non inocere. And we have slowly evolved toward a more societal approach where we are working for the greater public good. So I won't go into the details of this, but it's an extremely interesting way to look at it. And to bring this to somewhat of a conclusion, if I can look at the issue of social responsibility, if I can go back to that previous slide, Ronnie, on social responsibility. So what we've seen in the evolution of the professions in Quebec is that we have moved more toward a new societal role of the professional orders, because we have moved more toward a collective approach to the protection of the public, rather than the individual approach or the minimalist approach, which we mentioned before, especially in organizations like the bar or the College of Physicians. So the key in the evolution of the system has been to update the whole ethos of the system, and to look at societal responsibility as one of the founding principles of the new professional system as it's evolving. because it's going to go beyond the minimalist professional-client relationship, and it's going to extend to the larger public interest through new mechanisms that are currently being put in place. So when one looks at professionalism in Quebec and in other jurisdictions, it's clear that, yes, there is a common backdrop, but it's not something which is static, it's evolving. And these professions are constantly changing as we move forward. So to wrap up this particular section, then the remaining sessions will focus on 4 areas of practice, so that rather than talking about the theory, which I've been talking about, you're actually going to get a chance to listen to people who actually work on the ground. And so we'll be able to witness professionals at work and their personal reactions to the minimalist and maximalist approaches to professional ethics and societal engagement, which we've discussed in our introductory comments. And the areas which will come up will be healthcare, administration, legal professions, that includes lawyers and notaries, engineering and architecture in concert with experienced professionals. And as Ronnie Gare mentioned at the outset, most of the professionals who will be speaking to us are members of either the Chavrashas congregation or the Spanish and Portuguese congregation. So thank you very much for your attention. And during the Q&A period afterward, we'll try to answer any questions that come up. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Archibald. So we're going to move right along to Rabbi Maimon Pinto. Just a couple of words of introduction for those who don't know Rabbi Pinto. I think most of the people that are watching do know him, but anyway, for the recording especially. So Rabbi Pinto was born in Ashdod in Israel. His parents migrated to Montreal in 1986 with their 4 children. After successfully graduating from Talmudic studies and recognizing his communication abilities and his language skills, his rabbis encouraged him to pursue rabbinical studies. Rabbi Pinto received his rabbinical ordination, his smicha, from Kolel Or Yaakov in Rehovot in Israel, and an additional rabbinical certificate from the chief rabbi of Israel at that time, Benjamin Lau. Rabbi Pinto's passion for Judaism and teaching made him a much beloved teacher and a sought-after speaker. Recently, he was named senior rabbi of our synagogue, of the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue. He lives in Montreal with his wife, Gali, and their 3 children, Menachem, Deborah, and Rivka. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over the screen to Rabbi Pinto.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. Thank you, James. That was very interesting and very informative. I've given the task to share with you rabbinic professionalism and the different issues of rabbinic expectations on the individual level and communal level, and the way it's expressed in different communities is not the task tonight. It's something that is very scattered. We don't have, there's not a clear book about rabbinic professionalism or codes of ethics. Is very recent historically. The RCA, Rabbinical Council of America, and Rabbinical Council of Canada, the RCC, have put together a guide of ethics for rabbis recently in 2018. Even the rabbinate in Israel, fairly recent, in 2019, have put a code of ethics for rabbis. So tonight, what I'll share with you is my findings of the many scattered sources in Talmud or in responses, she'elot v'tshuvot, that we find through historically through different rabbis, an array of rabbis through the world, whether it's in Ashkenaz rabbis or Sephardic rabbis. And to see, first of all, to address the first question, let me just share the screen with you, whether a rabbi is a professional. Let me just share the screen with you right now. Okay, so the finding, first of all, is we see a lot of writings in the Talmud about rabbinic duties and responsibilities, but we don't find these clear definitions of a professional in a sense that the way Professor James just explained it. From deducing from different sources of the Talmud, we find ethical responsibility on the individual, on an individual level, whether it's through Halakha or knowledge of Torah and so forth, of what is expected from a rabbi, qualities and character traits that we see repetitively as a source, mainly maybe in Pirkei Avot, is a great source of expectation and codes of ethics that were expected from a rabbi. As to the details of character traits and moral values as humility and the roles of a rabbi, and even to the minute details of what he should wear and how he should dress, how he should walk, not to have any stains on his clothes, and so forth, as we go through the different sources in the Talmud, and we get a very clear definition of what is a professional rabbi. So many, as I just mentioned, is that through history and through the Talmud itself, many have dealt with the character and the roles of the rabbi and his proper conduct. The rabbi's office was dependent on his proper conduct in the eyes of his rabbis, colleagues, and disciples. But what is additionally important, and this is really what we are looking at tonight, is to define the ethics of the rabbinate in the broadest sense, while analyzing halachic sources written over the generation, in all generations, and let that be clear, that through generations, the rabbinate has perceived itself as a profession. Not, as Professor Ger mentioned, it's not something that is recognized today by the Quebec government, but as an independent authority, the rabbinate always perceived itself as a profession, and they view that not everyone deserves to be a rabbi. A person has to receive a certain certification in order to belong to this exclusive professional community of community rabbis and halachic judges. So yes, to the answer to the question, a rabbi is a professional. What is rabbinic professionalism? So at the forefront of the demands of the world of ethics and professionalism is based, among other things, on systematic body of knowledge, theory, and empirical facts, and is acquired through learning. So too, when we speak about rabbinical leadership, like any other profession, requires professionalism. And in that sense, professionalism here begins with beginning of the professionalism is in the Torah knowledge. And we find this very demanding teaching from Rabbi Yochanan, taken from the Talmud and Shabbat, that says as follows: who is a Torah scholar? Who may be appointed as a leader of the community? Asks Rabbi Yochanan. This is the one who is asked about matters of Halakha on any topic, and he is able to answer. And even if he were asked about tractate Kala, a tractate that few have mastered. Now, to anyone that ever learned a little bit of the Talmud, tractate Kala is a tractate that almost nobody learns. So the demand here is great, and covering the knowledge of the Talmud and through the Jewish Halakha, whether it's everything that follows and all the Rishonim, the Rambam and the Ramban and so forth, is a very demanding and a very large, broad knowledge of Torah that is demanded. So professionalism, rabbinical professionalism, like any other one, starts with the knowledge of Torah. First of all, you have to know as much as possible of Torah. Now, rabbinical professionalism also includes the ability to recognize the professionalism of others having the same profession. In other words, recognizing that that you are part of a much greater and broader, as having your independent identity, you're also have to view yourself as being in a much broader sense part of a rabbinical brotherhood, if you will. It is also important, and this is a very important factor for defining the identity of the professional himself, that is part of a rabbinical community. So part of this professionalism, rabbinic professionalism, is recognizing that, while recognizing that you're part of a wider spectrum of rabbis, of the community of rabbis, is part of the rabbinical identity in a sense of professionalism. It should be emphasized that the rabbinical professionalism is constantly evolving and refining. This is not only a natural tendency, but also an ethical duty. So part of this ethical duty is rabbinical professionals must develop at all time and be consistently updated on the innovations in their field. So that is viewed in rabbinic professionalism as something ethical. If a rabbi is not up to date with the with the changing nature of halachic questions, is viewed as someone that is not ethical. If you don't understand how electricity works, or you don't understand how certain things work in science or in other fields, you're not able to answer properly in halachic questions. And as we will see later on, that the great responsibility of a rabbi is his ability also to, and his Torah responsibility to answer properly halachic questions, being that he is the halachic authority. He's demanded to constantly be up to date with the new trends or any other new things. Things like questions that, I'll give you just one example. People ask whether they can run their business on Amazon while it's working on Shabbat, for example. And somebody is purchasing something while you're sleeping, but it's Shabbat. Are you allowed to benefit from such funds? And so forth. So, and if someone that doesn't do that, he's a rabbi that doesn't keep himself up to date, is viewed as someone that is not ethical while keeping rabbinic professionalism. Now, that being said, we find a very demanding of the rabbis to use their humility. However, there is a caveat to the Torah knowledge. In other words, there's limitation and boundaries to the Torah knowledge, the duty of prudence. This is summed up briefly by Rabbi Yehuda's principal guidance in Pirkei Avot. The duty of prudence is in study and instruction requires the rabbi to act humbly, meaning he must be humble in his study and ruling, for erroneous ruling may beget people to act improperly and maliciously. And the basic understanding is that humility is a condition for his study. So humility is not just viewed in terms of learning. So it continues. It's one single entity. It's not a side thing. When we speak about learning and acquiring humility is not viewed as two separate entities, but while learning and acquiring knowledge, one has to acquire also humility in his learning as he progresses in his learning. So at all times, study accompanied with humility. Why is this so important? Because this will lead him to the understanding that he must always learn more and more, and that he must recognize what he does not know. So a rabbi that doesn't have that humility to recognize that there are certain things that he still doesn't understand, or there's certain things that he still doesn't know and he needs to explore. And if he feels that he knows everything, well, he will stop learning in a sense. And that is a great danger because, as we said before, the rabbi constantly has to be up to date. What he doesn't know, he has to find out and he has to explore. And that humility brings him to, the element of humility here brings him to understand that there's certain things that he needs to learn and he needs to discover and recognize what he doesn't know. In tractate, and there's a very pointy teaching and tractate of Derech Eretz in Derech Eretz that says, teach your tongue to say, I do not know, lest you be deceived and be held accountable. So just as we just mentioned, a rabbi who practices humility benefits from this, both in his dealings with his community and in the fulfillment of rabbinical responsibility. Now, what is humility exactly here? We'll try to define, at least in this context, when we speak about professional humility. Humility does not mean that the rabbi will give up his self-esteem and his status as a source of knowledge and community leadership, but that the rabbi will recognize that his opinion and ruling are important, and that he always has the duty to learn more and become wise in his teachings. In other words, a rabbi that doesn't take his job seriously, and it's kind of like a little bit of a paradox here, because on one hand, he has to recognize that his opinion is very, very important, which doesn't sound very a state of humility. But on the other hand, if a rabbi doesn't take his job or his position seriously, he might not give the proper answer to people. He might not take so seriously and not answer in a wise way to people when they address them to any kind of issues, specifically in the realm of Halakha. So this humility is expressed in the fact that he recognizes that he has a sense of responsibility, and that his opinion is very important, and the ruling that he'll give to someone that asks him a question is very important. And that will bring him a humility to constantly try to grow, and that his teaching will be and his answers will be in a wise way. So professional humility here that brings him to answer properly to those that address him with their questions. Now, here we are rabbinic responsibilities and on the level of halakha. Now, just to make sure that we're not talking about knowledge, because we just covered that. Just here we're talking about Torah responsibility. Rabbinical responsibility requires him to value his words and action, as he is a key factor in the community life and must be an example and a role model. The rabbinical responsibility includes several elements. And I'll start naming the first one, which is the rabbi has to have a Torah responsibility, which expresses his professionalism. We find this in Pirkei Avot again, as a source in chapter 1, Mishnah 11, Avtalion, which was a great sage and was a Av Bedin, is a judge, said the following statement: sages, be careful with your words, lest you be carried off to a place of evil waters, and the disciples who follow you drink and die. This is a very, maybe harsh. Drinking and dying. It's viewed in a sense that Torah responsibility, that a person, the rabbi has to be responsible in a sense that he takes his time and weighs the matter that is asked to give a ruling over. So it's not so much about his knowledge, but the rabbi is asking, Halakha must do everything to reach and clarify the truth, even if the matter involves delaying his answer and not leaving any loose ends. Meaning that Torah responsibility here is not the knowledge, but is really taking the time to answer properly. I'd like just to share a very short story of a rabbi that a certain woman from his community came to ask him a question, and it seemed to be a very simple question, but nevertheless, the rabbi went over to his libraries as the woman was sitting in her office and waiting for an answer. And he went over and he opened his book, and he was looking inside his book for about 10 to 15 minutes, which was a very simple question. And his students that were in the room while he was going through the whole process, were astonished to see that the rabbi is not answering right away. And after 10 or 15 minutes, the rabbi closes the book and he gives the lady that's in front of him the answer. She's very happy and she leaves. When she leaves, his students ask him, Rabbi, why did you take so long to answer the question? It was a very simple question. So Rabbi answers, look, Torah responsibility is expressed in the way that you answer to people as well. And even if you know the answer, at times you have to go back, look inside the sources, look inside the Shulchan Aruch, because maybe there's some details that you have forgotten. And your responsibility also is to give the proper attention to the person that comes in front of you. If I would have answered right away, maybe the lady would have thought that her question was not so important. It was so simple. The next time she will have a real question or a more difficult question, she would maybe be reluctant to come to my office and ask me the question when it was really something very important. So here the Torah responsibility is in the sense that the rabbi has to really take the time and to evaluate every details of the questions and even delay sometimes until he answers. Now, so part of rabbinic responsibilities is rebuke. And we find this over and over through the Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch. And not rebuke is a positive mitzvah that is in the Torah, not only for rabbis, but even for Jews among themselves. Rebuking a friend constructively is viewed as a positive mitzvah, especially when we're talking about a community rabbi. The rabbi's Torah responsibility also obliges him to reprimand those who do not behave properly, and he must do so with the required wisdom, firmness, and sensitivity. But we all know that rebuking and reprimanding could be a very tricky thing, and therefore it takes a certain amount of sensitivity and understanding who the person. There are times that being silent is also a mitzvah. There's a special, a very known adage in the Talmud that says, "Keshem sheyesh mitzvah lomar hadavar anishma, ken yesh mitzvah lo lomar hadavar shelo nishma." There's a mitzvah to say, to reprimand, as we said, but there's also a mitzvah sometimes to just be quiet and not say what you have to say. And I brought this from Rabbi Avraham Shmuel Benjamin Sofer. He held that the commandment of rebuking is one of the most difficult commandments to observe, since one has to weigh all the possible scenarios that may occur and how people will react to his rebuke. In the event that the members of the community does not follow the law, the rabbi's role is to also carefully consider whether it would be right to comment or silence. Sometimes it is the sharp and loud protest that can be an act that costs more than it benefits. So obviously rebuking is part of this, of his responsibility when he sees that something is not going well in the community, or something needs to be fixed, or whatever it is. But at the same time, at his discretion, he has to recognize when things could be more beneficial when he doesn't say anything. He keeps silence. Rabbinical responsibilities in the realm of justice. This is something that to many rabbis is the ultimate responsibility of the rabbi. The rabbi has a communal responsibility to raise the level of the moral and ethic values of his community. The rabbi's social responsibility is mainly expressed in his concern for the weak population, the lonely, the poor, and all the others powerless in society, such as orphans and widows. And this, I copied here a very strong statement from Rabbi Soloveitchik, which was the Rosh Yeshiva in YU. And he says as follows: the beacon of light of a rabbi is not the teaching nor the political leadership, but the fulfillment of the ideals of justice, and by so fulfilling the role assigned to him, namely tikkun ha'olam. So this is quite astonishing, because so far we've learned that rabbinical positions, of course, require teaching and leadership, but that's not the main point for the rabbi. According to Rabbi Soloveitchik, his main focus and his beacon of light, as he says it, is to really protect and tzedek tirdof, like the pasuk says, justice to those that are powerless in society is what makes the rabbi the ultimate rabbi, if you will. Now, education. And this is something that I found that in some communities, people did not, in past communities, it was known that the rabbi is first and foremost a teacher. And I've come to learn in different communities that not that I've worked at, but that I have other friends that work, that the rabbi is not necessarily viewed as the figure of education. He is more preoccupied with other things than education. But in any case, here I found that many sources that to really the education really gives an expression to what the rabbi's role in the community. So an additional and an important rabbinical responsibility expected from the rabbi is educational responsibility. It should be remembered that in the past, rabbi was primarily an educational figure and engaged in teaching. And this is sad because in those days, the rabbi usually was either the Rosh Yeshiva or he was a teacher in the Talmud Torah. And because of his great Torah knowledge, he also kind of became the Mara De'atra, the rabbi of the city. But primarily his job was to be the Rosh Yeshiva or to be an educator in the Talmud Torah. Over the years, the authority of the rabbi of the community expanded, and it was his responsibility to take care of the education of all the children of the community, the next generation. In order to perform the task on the best side, the rabbi must know and study the world of the youth. And this is quite astonishing, and also get to know the changing moods around him. This is a quote from Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Yechiel Weinberg in his prologue of Sride Esh, which was a very famous until this day responses of questions. And educational responsibility, it says, also requires a rabbi to make himself accessible to members of his community and to be aware of the importance of his educational role in community life in general and in the youth life in particular. I found so many other sources about educational, particularly to this idea of to study the world of the youth. And as the rabbi evolves in his teaching, he also has to be very aware of the trends that are going on around him and what the youth is into. I found even a very interesting source that says that the rabbi should play basketball with some of his members, his young members. He should take them out to picnics and kind of interact with them on a very social level in order to bring them back, in order to have to give them this influence of doing Torah and mitzvot and accomplishing. So the educational part here, besides his presentations and his sermons and so forth, the rabbi is expected also to give quite a lot of time and thinking about how he could bring the youth closer to their Jewish identity. I like this part of Yechiel Weinberg from Sride Esh, his prologue, so much that I really wanted to read this with you and to quote him as he goes along. So let's see this together from Rabbi Weinberg. Rabbis, as subjects of God's word, must explain to their people in the world the opinion of Judaism of all of the problems of morality, law and social correction that the new generation is struggling with. They must show that Judaism is not, I think it should be, it's not a collection of religious laws and customs alone, but rather a decisive spiritual force in human life. The rabbi needs to know what is happening around him in the world of science and literature, the renewed currents of spirits from period to period. Without systematic training and without knowledge of the language of the modern thought, he will not be able to find the path and mental touch to the inner world of youth and the new generation. So this is quite a big task, if you ask me, for the rabbi to be so involved in the youth and understanding what the youth is expecting and what the youth and kind of go into their world in order to bring them closer to their Jewish identity. Now, this so far we've seen together the responsibility and really the role of a rabbi. What is really the role of a rabbi? I have to say that it's so broad. All you have to do maybe is look at the bylaws of the Spanish and Portuguese. Maybe you'll get a very good idea of what is the role, the different roles of the rabbi. But it's almost impossible to cover every single aspect of what would be considered the roles of the rabbi. And I think that if you ask people this question, you'll get a lot of different answers. The role of the rabbi as is viewed maybe by his peers, and how is viewed by his students, and what people expect of him, and what is viewed at the executive level when you're working at a synagogue that works with a board and executive, could have very different answers. So I've kind of summed it up here by two different rabbis, the Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Yehuda Adaya, and the chief rabbi of IDF, Rabbi Shlomo Goren. And Rabbi Yehuda Adaya sums it up in this way: to be comfortable with people, to bring hearts together, to outreach, to act in humility, to appear before the congregation, to teach them the way of the Torah, to be a role model, to practice what he preaches, to stand as a shutter against outbursts, to be very attentive to what is happening in the field of kashrut, in the field of education, in the field of religion. Again, I think it covers a lot, but definitely not everything of what a role of a rabbi is. Rabbi Yehuda Adaya also spoke to a crowd that is more observant, to a crowd that is conscious of their responsibilities and that follow the halakha to the T. And that's why it doesn't necessarily speak to every audience. And I think that's one of the challenges for a rabbi, as understanding his role, or other people, the way they understand the role of a rabbi, is that it fluctuates between different people and different levels of observance. As we see here from Chief Rabbi of IDF, Rabbi Shlomo Goren, the rabbi has to have a constant dialogue with his observant and non-observant members. The mission of the rabbi in this age should be aimed at elevating the secular life and to the unity of people around the values of Torah. An ideal rabbi is the one who loves people and people love him and ask for his closeness. This was from Chief Rabbi Shlomo, the previous Chief Rabbi of the IDF, Rabbi Shlomo Goren. And here we see a somewhat of a contrast between both of the opinions, where Rabbi Goren speaks to a broader audience. He also teaches that the idea of ideals and values that are kind of universal, without getting into the nitty-gritty of halakha, and kind of bringing people together by bringing the values of Torah to them, and not necessarily the halakha part of the Torah to them. Dignity. I spoke at the beginning of the presentation about dignity of the rabbi and how he must conduct himself. And this is a very fascinating Talmud in Masechet Brachot, in page 43. And it says that there are 6 things that are disgraceful for a Torah scholar. He may not go out perfumed into the marketplace. He may not go out of his house alone at night. He may not go out wearing patched shoes. He may not converse with a strange woman in the marketplace. He may not recline and participate in a meal in the company of ignoramuses. And he may not be the last to enter the study hall. And some say that he may not take long strides, and he may not walk with an upright posture. So there's so many other opinions that in this specific Gemara of other sages, but what we do, we see that it follows that the rabbi must be aware of his actions and outward appearance at all times. There's even the very Gemarot, Talmudic sources that speak about how a rabbi should wear a shirt and what kind of shirt and how he should be presentable, the way he should walk. Upright posture, we said here, is it shows on someone that has ga'ava, arrogance, and so forth. So the level of expectancy of the rabbi is also the way he acts outwards in his appearance at all time.
Rabbi, sorry to interrupt, but we're rapidly running out of time.
Yeah,
and we would like to have a bit of time for questions. So if it would be possible to wrap up soon, please.
Sure, I'm finished. Conclusion.
Okay, great, thanks.
So, in conclusion, what we've seen here is that most people tend to focus on the rabbi's Torah education, and the technical aspects of his actions, community leaderships, delivering sermons, ruling on Halakha, and caring for all religious needs, such as slaughter, iruv, and mikveh. However, let us not forget that every rabbi is also committed to ethical behavior. The rules of proper conduct define both his work and his communal responsibilities. The sages over the generations around the world have been able to shape the ethical image of the rabbis. They listed the qualities the rabbi must have, such as Torah understanding, professional humility, and educational social Torah responsibility. It is worthwhile to expand and deepen further around these requirements in order to strengthen the rabbi's status and refine his action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Pinto, and before you, Professor Archibald. So we have a few minutes for questions. We had planned to end this session at 8:30. We can go on a little bit longer, five or 10 minutes longer, but we don't want to go on much longer than that. What I would ask you is, if you do have a question, please raise your hand, but it should please be a question, not a whole long discussion or a comment. So I see one hand now of Albert Huskovich. So please, Albert, go ahead.
Hi, Ronnie. Thank you, Ronnie. You mentioned your last comment after I raised my hand, because I had a small comment to address both Professor Archibald and my dear Rabbi Pinto. It's a personal experience I had as a young professional. I was a young engineer coming out of engineering school, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. And I joined a large company with tens of thousands of people and with many hundreds of engineers. And I joined what was called then an association of engineers of the company as a member. And from being a member, I graduated to become a vice president of the association. And as you probably know me, I'm always involved in all kinds of activities, so I became president of the association. That being said, I was looking at other engineers working in other places. For example, the city of Montreal, the province of Quebec, and they were all unionized and had a limited number of hours that they worked at. For example, 32 hours for the engineers in the city and the province of Quebec, same with Hydro-Quebec. And I found we were working 40, 45, 50 hours a week, sometimes 60 hours a week. And we were not compensated at all. There was no overtime pay. There was no time, extra time for overtime worked. The reason being that we were considered to be professionals, quote unquote. Being professionals, you're part of management, and it is expected of you to put in the hours and work late and put in the hours. Whereas other employees who were working side by side with us were unionized, or if they were not unionized, they were always compensated for extra time, for overtime. They were paid overtime, and to the point where some of them were making more than us engineers. And so at that point, I tried to get us organized. And by organized, meaning create a union. And I approached the Order of Engineers, and I started getting the ball rolling. And one day, lo and behold, my phone rings, and who is it? It's the secretary of the vice president. And I'm told that the vice president wants to see me. So I go in to see the vice president, and I'm informed, Albert, I hear that you're trying to organize our engineers. You want to create a union, and that's a no-no. And if you don't cease and desist from doing that, you're going to have to find yourself another job somewhere else. What is one supposed to do at that point when you try to get some ethics and improve the quality of the work environment for professionals? And then you're told, as a professional, it is expected of you to work long hours without remuneration. And if you get organized and create a union, you're out of the company. So it was a big decision I had to make. Of course, in order to maintain my job, I had to cease and desist. And that was the end of my involvement in creating a professional union.
Professor Archibald, maybe you could answer that or respond at least, please.
I think I should take Rabbi Pinto's advice. I'm going to study the question and come back to you later. But a quick take on that, and this is something which we discuss at the level of a government, is that you're looking at three types of organizational contexts. On the one hand, you're looking at associations. On another hand, you're looking at unions. And on the third side, you're looking at professional orders, which are responsible for professional behavior. So if you break it down from that point of view, the associations are very much interested in the communal interests of the members of the association. You know that as someone who's worked in that environment. If, however, you're looking at the union side, you're looking at a group which is going to position itself in order to obtain the greatest advantage possible for the members of that particular group. So on the one hand, you're looking at a corporatist type of position. On the other hand, you're looking at a union type of position. And on the other hand, you're looking within a professional order at a group which by law is established for the sole purpose of protecting the public. And it may be that if your union wins in a negotiation, it may not be necessarily in the public interest. We're talking about a strike in the Port of Montreal today, for instance. That's one good example. Or the association. And in many cases, the objectives can be convergent. They don't necessarily have to lead to conflict. And this is one of the reasons why it's extremely important for professionals who are working in these different environments with different types of expectations to be able to look at conflict and to try to work through the conflict and to find a reasonable, if you recall back in the different codes of ethics, the term reasonable comes back on a regular basis, reasonable accommodation of differences in order to make sure that both the professionals can function as professionals. If you work them too hard, they're not going to be able to function that well. But there has to be an outcome of this which will be to the benefit of both the clientele and the employers, etc. In Quebec, this is particularly interesting because many professionals are in fact employees. Many of them are employees of the government, to wit, the energy sector, the healthcare sector, and so on. But what is important, I think, is to bear in mind what we're looking at today as a societal responsibility of the professional in working through these types of negotiations. So there's no one easy answer to your question and the dilemma, and you sort of have to sort it out for yourself. But the bottom line is that unions, associations, and professional orders have very different objectives at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you. And we have a question from Charlie Mark Hadid. Please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hi, Rabbi, I have a question for you. So I understand that the rabbinical brotherhood or whatnot, like the rabbis have a certain quote unquote ethic to follow within themselves and within their group, even though there's no union or association as such to represent them. But if the rabbis are supposed to be held to a certain ethical level, and the basic one being the 10 Commandments, what punishment or what, I guess, consequence should rabbis have if they don't follow at least the minimal laws? So let's say, and of course, rabbis are very involved in being close to members and having a hands-on approach with several things. So there's obviously rabbis a rabbi is a human person, and they can obviously do mistakes of all sorts. So what kind of consequence are we allowed to like strip them of their position or give them like a probation or something if they're caught in an act that doesn't follow the basic laws of what they're themselves preaching, in a way where it's hypocrisy, like lo tignov or lo tachmod, or if they get involved even in a business transaction that's not so kosher, like, there's many issues that we've seen around the world in all of those aspects. So what's your take on something like that?
Well, yeah. First of all, there are organizations, as I mentioned at the beginning, like RCA or RCC or the Rabbinate in Israel, that you're part of them, which have their own codes of ethics, whatever we will call institutionalized rabbinate. So there is a code of law, and yes, the RCA can hold the rabbi accountable, and the rabbi could be stripped of his position, just like any other employee. There are discussions in the Talmud about rabbis that did not act ethically and morally properly, and the only condition or only exception that the Talmud speaks about whether one is allowed to excommunicate cherem. Is a rabbi allowed to be in cherem? Can a rabbi could be excommunicated from the community? That's really the only deep discussion that we find in the Talmud, whether the community will be allowed to put the rabbi in such a situation of being in cherem. Just cherem is a very harsh, not just for a rabbi, for anyone. A person that's in cherem will not be allowed to be included in a minyan. One is not allowed to speak to him. One has to distance himself from him, and so forth. Is the only thing that the Talmud says, that a Talmid Chacham or a rabbi should not be in such a position of cherem. But of all others behaviors that the rabbi does not act properly, of course, that as we've seen in the past, unfortunately, could be stripped of his position as a serving rabbi in the community.
Okay, great, thank you. Are there any more questions or comments? So if not, oh.
Sorry, Ronnie. If I can just add to Rabbi Pinto's comment, if you look at it from the licensed professional's point of view, and you find a professional who is in violation of the code of ethics, for instance, then obviously a member of the public can make a complaint to this regard. And that complaint then is heard by the appropriate authority within the professional order. And the person can be disciplined. And the person eventually, if the complaint is serious enough, if there's a sufficient prejudice with regard to the public, and the public may potentially be harmed by this person's action, then the person's permit can be revoked. And from a secular point of view, that's the equivalent of putting someone into cherem.
Thank you.
So I think in conclusion, since there are no other questions, I just want to point out, and I think that Professor Archibald will agree with me that the law of the land overrides all of this. You know, it's you cannot have a professional order or ethics or code for the professionals and for the rabbinate that goes outside of the law of the land. So there's always that part as well. Will you agree with that, Professor Archibald?
Sure. I mean, even from a rabbinic point of view, I don't want to steal Rabbi Pinto's thunder, but from a rabbinical point of view, members of the community have to recognize the importance of law of the land. And that's why we always recognize the authority of the state. So even though there may be conflicts halachically, we still have to recognize the authority of the state. And if there is some accommodation that has to be made, then we have to find ways around that. And that's why that level of Torah knowledge, which the rabbi spoke of, is extremely important in trying to resolve those types of issues.
Yes, but Dr. Archibald, I have something to say about what you said. So in regards to the orders, I myself being part of one, if like you said, an engineer or a professional does something wrong or does not follow the code of ethics and there's a complaint done against them, they can then get radiated or removed from the role. However, that does not always apply to the rabbinical side. I mean, it seems as if the orders are much more stringent on, we'll call it the public safety, where as well the rabbinate is also supposed to be in the public's interest, but there are ways to get around it. Like at any point in time, even in the professions, you're able to fight the conviction or the complaint, whereas you might have a stellar credibility or your personal reputation is going to have more weight versus that one act that might have been done without thinking of the consequence or improperly following the law or whichever the event might have been. But in any case, it could have been a very terrible event that would have caused for you to be radiated or removed from such a role.
Okay, just for your own purposes, the English expression for radiation is to be struck from the role. But the point of your question is that the rabbinate is not a recognized professional body as far as legislation is concerned. It only has a certain number of recognized acts under law which are important to consider. One being the area of marriage. And so members of the rabbinate do have a certain amount of power in terms of marriage. But other than that, there is no reserved act under law for rabbis in the current system, unless they decide that they want to get together and apply to become a professional order.
Okay, so thanks. I think this is a good point to wrap things up. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody that has been attending. Please spread the word so that next time, hopefully we'll have even more people. So the next session is on Monday, May 24th, and it's going to be dealing with healthcare. We've lined up some really outstanding speakers, and there may still be an additional one. So Professor Archibald will return to speak about medical assistance in dying. Then we have a dentist who's also one of the chazans of Chevra Shas, Dr. Joshua Haimovici. We have a nurse, Laurie Gottlieb, who's, I believe, chair of the Department of Nursing at McGill. And the moderator will be Rabbi Barak Hetzroni, who's the chaplain of the Jewish General Hospital. So this promises to be a really interesting session, Monday, May 24th, at the same time, 7 o'clock, and the same link. So thanks again for everyone for attending.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you, James.